This is the inaugural event. I am so excited for this moment. First I want to make sure that I pay homage. So I want to thank the creator for this moment in time, for everybody who's going to be tuning in, everyone who's going to be watching with us. I'm really thankful for that. And I want to pay homage for myself. I'm on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. So I want to make sure I pay homage to the land that I reside on. And I want to thank our guests specifically. Justin, I appreciate you being part of this inaugural event. And it means a lot to me. I reached out to you and you were one of the first people that responded. So I appreciate you. And I don't know if you remember, but we crossed paths at the Kamloops powwow. I think it was last year.
Yeah.
And man, that was the first time we actually really crossed paths physically. So I'm really grateful and wanted to thank you for taking your time out of your day. I know these COVID times are challenging in its own way. So thank you for contributing to this whole No Blueprint, man. It means a lot to me, for real. And also everyone who's tuning in, we got people tuning in on our Instagram. The Zoom is a different platform. We're live on Facebook. And I want to make sure I pay homage to the audience, because everybody who's tuning in, there's a great opportunity here to learn something. I'm an artist entrepreneur myself, and there's been no blueprint to help me get me where I'm at. And so to have Justin here to share his story, where he comes from, the intentions of this podcast is really to help give you some guidance or perspective or experience about how you can, navigate whatever industry you're passionate about. And I feel so fortunate to have, a guest such as Justin, who's here, who's accomplished so much. And, there's so many ways we can get into this thing. And usually a bio would happen at this point. But I really feel this whole No Blueprint podcast is a bio. So I'm gonna let our special guest, Justin Lewis, provide us some perspective of where he came from. So before we get started though, Justin, I just want to warm up a little bit. I'm gonna do an icebreaker with you. What is one of your favorite early childhood memories?
Ooh, that's a good one. Probably when I was growing up, my dad was a rodeo cowboy. So a lot of my childhood was riding sheep and riding horses. And so, hitting the rodeo trail with my dad when I was young was one of the fun things that we used to do. We used to travel all over into the prairies and then, all the way down into the States. So that's probably like one of the things that sticks out in my mind.
It's amazing. A childhood memory, is with your family. I think that's really important. And speaking of that, man, tell us a little bit about where you're from. A lot of people may not know where you're from. So let us know where you're from and where did you grow up, man?
Yeah, so I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, Treaty 6 territory, and I was raised out in Musquecheese, Alberta, out in Treaty 6 on the Samson Reserve. So that's where my dad and his family are all from, and my mom is from New Mexico originally. So I've got kind of family spread out all over, but I was born and raised in the prairies. So
nice. And where do you live now?
I live in Skokiel First Nation, which is in Chilliwack, BC, unceded Stalo territory. So it's where I lay my hat.
Nice. What was it like leaving home for the first time to travel to your new home where you're at now?
Well, it's crazy because I moved away as soon as I finished high school, I moved to California. So that was a big culture shock, coming from a reserve in the middle of central Alberta and then ending up down in California. And it was such a different world for me. So, that was fresh out of high school. I hadn't lived, I'd lived with my parents my whole life. And, I got recruited to go play baseball down there. Me and my twin brother, packed up our stuff at the end of summer and moved to California. And it was like a whole new world for us. So, but it really opened my eyes to, I guess a lot of stuff, what's outside the reserve.
So as a young person, you mentioned you played baseball.
Yeah.
What was that like, man? Give us a little bit of insight about what it was like playing baseball. Why baseball anyways?
Yeah. Well, I started, playing baseball probably when I was 12. We started, playing competitively. And so there was a small team, and, we played with in my reserve. And then as me and my brother kind of got older, we kind of got better. And, we ended up having to go play, in the neighboring towns and then eventually in the city to play at, I guess, the highest level you play at. That led kind of, eyes to get exposure and scouts and all that stuff. And we ended up getting recruited to play down in a junior college in California. And,
Wow.
I look back on it, it was pretty cool. It was, there's a lot of things that, I probably would have never got to do or experience if it wasn't for baseball. So that was kind of a bridge for, getting outside of the reserve and seeing what else is out there and what's possible. So.
Is that what you mean by not experiencing certain things if you didn't play baseball? Is like going outside of the reserve and doing different things?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I had, when I was in high school, I had no interest in going to college at all. I was the last of my, but in order to keep playing baseball, I had to go to school, right? So it kind of forced my hand at the post-secondary education thing. And then through that, I ended up, going into business school, which kind of got me to where I'm at today, at least like a step in that direction. So there's all these little pieces that led to one thing, led to the next. And that's kind of where I'm at. So
nice. Was it just baseball you played as a youngin?
I played hockey and baseball up until high school, but I was a better baseball player than I ever was a hockey player. So
interesting.
And just baseball was kind of like my passion, so.
Nice. I can relate to you. I grew up not necessarily playing the same sports, but I played soccer my whole life, and then I transitioned into basketball. And I think those were really good building blocks in the sense of learning how to work as a team and just leadership skills, competitiveness, and just a healthy upbringing. I think it really helped keep me out of trouble at the same time.
Yeah.
Some would argue differently, but I think it really did help. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I kept me out of trouble for sure. I was a restless teenager, just like probably everybody else was. But I had a schedule to play sports, and that was kind of kept me off the streets from doing stuff I shouldn't be doing. So
no doubt. So this is going to be a bit more of a challenging question, but I'm going to give you some context here. It wasn't until I was in my early 20s. So this isn't like back in, I would say, 2008, 2009. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had their first national event in Winnipeg at the Forks, and I got hired as sports tent coordinator. And my mother's from Ocean First Nation in Saskatchewan, Nakota. I have really close ties with my family. But, being part of that event in Winnipeg was the first time I was exposed to that part of my history as a young person. And so that's when it started for me. I understood more about my identity, more about how my grandmothers were treated, more about how my relatives on Ocean First Nation, my aunties and uncles were treated. So my question is, when did you start learning about your identity and understanding who you are as a human being?
Well, see, I was, obviously I was raised in my community and I was surrounded by my aunties and uncles. And so from a very young age, they were always kind of instilling, who we are as Cree people, and, we're Treaty Indians, so I grew up kind of immersed in that surrounding. And, even to this day, my aunties, they still talk about all that stuff. So, but to really, going, being, a fair-skinned kid in the reserve was tough as well, because, I didn't look native enough for some people. And then growing up, going to school off reserve, I was not white, I was native. So there was always that kind of a bit of an identity struggle there for me, and then as I got older, it was challenging, but I've always held on to being Indigenous. And then as I got older and I became comfortable in my skin, it was more of a sense of pride that I carried, and wanting to go back and, and living away from home, kind of made me realize how important that aspect in my culture is in my life. And so that kind of pushed me back to really spend more time back home when I can, because when I was in college, the last thing on my mind was coming home, but as I lived away from home for a long time, I started to kind of feel a void, and starting to feel disconnected from my culture and my family and all that stuff. And so it just really reinstilled, how important that is to us as Indigenous people, right? And to maintain that connection, and even for people who are just trying to regain that connection, right? It's such an empowering thing for people. So,
man, that's deep. I appreciate you sharing that. And like, I can relate to you in a sense of, what you look like on the surface. Like I'm fairly dark, I would say.
Yeah.
You know, my father's from Kingston, Jamaica. And so for me, even still today, you know, in the sense of, you know, being a public figure, being in front of large audiences and going out there and being like, hey, I'm an Indigenous person and representing for Indigenous people, there's always that kind of feeling of what it's supposed to look like. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And so I love our generation and how we're breaking down those stereotypes. I think we're all human beings at the end of the day, and our relationship to the family, our land, and where we come from, I think is really where our indigeneity comes from. So I appreciate you sharing that, man. I can totally relate to you on a lot of those things. So as a young person, you know, growing up playing baseball, you know, navigating your identity, stuff like that, who were some of the people that you looked up to? Who were some of the celebrity idols maybe in your life at that time?
I mean, obviously playing baseball, you know, most of my, you know, the people that I did look up to were athletes for sure. So um I hadn't, you know, when I was in college and playing sports, it was, you know, it's mostly focused on sports, but I started paying attention to, you know, guys like Jacoby Ellsbury who were Indigenous and who had made it to that next level, right? And, you know, and not even just, I guess, baseball, but hockey as well, you know, guys like Jordan Tutu and, you know, playing hockey against him when I was at a very young age and then seeing him on TV, you know, playing in the NHL, you know, those were the kind of people that I looked up to, right?
Nice.
So,
What are your friends like? Like, who were some of your childhood friends growing up?
oh man, I have like a eclectic group of childhood friends. You know, I've got some guys, you know, some non-Indigenous friends who were some of my best friends, and a couple, you know, I still talk to some of them to this day. And then I've got, you know, my buddies from the reserve that I grew up playing hockey with, and then I've got a bag full of guys from college that, you know, I've, you know, as you get to that age, those guys become your family when you're living away from home. And so they're still some of my best friends and I still talk to them, you know, almost every week. So
Amazing. How some of them influenced who you are and like even some of your career choices today?
with a good way or a bad way?
No,
No.
whichever you want to share, my man.
No, I mean, they're all unique in their own ways. And, you know, some of them are crazy. Some of them are, you know, we're all getting to the age where we're having kids and settling down. But, you know, like one of my best friends, he was always a gym freak, right? So he's always kind of influenced to try and stay in shape and be healthy in that sense, you know. And then you've got, you know, some of the other guys who are just, you know, focused on sports and stuff, and they have that work ethic, or, you know, they understand business, or they, you know, some of the guys that we, you know, I know have ended up becoming pretty successfully in business, right? And so I've always like looked up to them as like, wow, these guys made it. You know, they were able to do something from nothing. You know,
Nice.
everybody has their own, I guess, different strengths and stuff.
For sure. Elaborate a little bit about what you mean by made it, you know, from your perspective. What does that mean to you?
It's that, I mean, I find that's kind of a loaded question, but I guess some of these guys coming from, you know, their families were from Mexico, right? They're first generation, you know, Americans, and their mom and dad had immigrated from Mexico to kind of create a better life for their family. And some of these guys, you know, they made it in the business world, I guess, if you want to say it, in the corporate world, you know. And there's the financial success, right? But there's also, I think, I look more at like the stability for your family, and being able to put a roof over your head, you know, and for your kids to be able to be in a safe environment, and to have access to their family, and all that stuff, right? And the way I look at it is, you know, I think their parents are pretty proud, because that was what they envisioned when they were coming from, you know, down in Mexico and coming into a foreign country. And, you know, everybody's got that American dream, but, you know, I think success means a little bit of different stuff to everybody, right? And so, you know, I guess in that context, it has to do with where their roots come from, right? And what they were able to do, you know, for the sacrifices that their family made for them. So
No doubt. So let me just try and recap here a little bit. You know, growing up on the res, playing sports, baseball was your favorite, you know, hanging out with some of your friends, close friends you still talk to today, being positively influenced that way. Tell us a little bit about some of the jobs you worked earlier on as a kid. Like, what was one of your first jobs that you've ever had?
my first job was at McDonald's, man.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was taking orders, working the drive-through. You know, if I got lucky, I got to flip burgers in the back. But yeah, I must have been 13 or 14, whenever I was old enough to go to work. You know, a bunch of my buddies were working at McDonald's, so that was like the cool place to work in town, in a small town, right? So
Wow, man, that's
yeah.
cool.
Mhm.
And what was one of the worst jobs you've ever had?
Um, ooh, I had a temp job right out of university doing. No. This was before I graduated. I was selling shoes
Okay.
in in a mall, in the department store, and not that there's anything wrong with it, but I just wasn't. I'm not a seller like that, you know, like to go up and greet people in the store and immediately trying to like push something on them. It was just not something that I vibed with, you know. But I had to do it to make some money, so.
Of course. Okay. And then one of the best jobs you've ever worked at?
Um, I mean, obviously, section, you know, being my own kind of brainchild, and that's probably like, you know, that takes the cake right now. But you know, my first real job out of university, I worked for for not a startup real estate, I guess, investment firm, and it was started by kind of a guy who broke off from a big corporate investment firm and started his own outfit. And he gave me a job working in the mailroom, and basically from, you know, the ground up, I learned a lot about business, entrepreneurship, marketing, business development, you know, even graphic design. You know, I worked, you know, and that kind of really was the catalyst for my interest in graphic design, and what I do today with Section, right? And working very closely with a graphic designer, and learning kind of the basics of design programs and the foundation of design and all that stuff. So that's probably the one that I look back at, you know, and then even just the CEO that gave me the job, you know, some of the advice that he gave me, and just seeing where he ended up, you know, even after I left that company and moved back home, you know, seeing what he was able to achieve. He kind of was able to do what he had planned on doing all along, right? And I remember reading in a business newspaper, you know, some years later about his, you know, his big business deal, and basically walked away from it, you know. And I was like, wow, that was what he had in mind this whole time, you know. So it was
Right.
cool to at least have a part from the ground up, you know, being, you know, at that time. And it was right in 2008 when the economy had tanked down there. So I was lucky to have a job. You know, my roommate lost his job. He was on unemployment, you know, like everybody was losing their jobs, their houses.
Sounds a
And
little familiar, no?
yeah, it's oddly familiar. So, but he was, you know, it was scary. It was a scary time, you know, and I was just thankful to have a job. You know, I wasn't making a lot of money, but you know, I was able to at least pay some of my bills, and go to work every day, whereas people didn't have that opportunity,
Right. So that I have so many amazing questions from that. Like, did you always see yourself working for yourself? Is that something that you've always had envisioned? Like, when did you know that working for someone else maybe didn't resonate with you as much as what you're doing now?
I think the longer that I started working, you know, and most of my professional life has been kind of working in the corporate world, and I've kind of grown like a disdain for the corporate world in a sense, just because it's cutthroat, right? You know, and there's, you know, in that kind of world, people are expendable, right? And I don't, you know, people are assets, but they're also expendable, and so, you know, working for somebody else, you know, you start doing stuff that you don't really enjoy doing,
Mm,
and realizing that, like, man, I hate going to work, or I'm not really feeling this. You know, if I did my own job, I could make my own hours, or I could do my own, you know, make my own schedule. That was kind of like starting to grasp that concept of being able to work on your own schedule, on your own time, and work on something that you actually are passionate about, right? And so it's probably like somewhere midway through my professional life where I started to realize, you know, maybe you know, I don't know what I'm going to do, but, or how I'll do that, but
yeah.
that's kind of where I realized that, okay, that to me, that's living the dream, is working for yourself, right? So,
Right.
whatever that
And
means.
as a young person, did you always imagine yourself working in clothing or in these corporate worlds, or did you see yourself as something else?
Honestly, the clothing thing, no. You know, I think the corporate world is going to business school, I find like that's kind of, the business school mentality. It kind of socializes you for the corporate world, right? Like a lot of your education in business school is focused on corporate, and so like you kind of get steered in that direction in a sense. And that's kind of how I felt. Now that I look back, it was like coming out of business school, I was like, oh, I want to work in like a big tower downtown and work in the business district. And now that I've done all that stuff, realizing that like, we're kind of led in that direction. If you don't think for yourself, like it's easy to be socialized and pushed into that world. And then just experiencing it myself, it was cool to say that I did all that stuff, but did it really fulfill, it didn't really fulfill what I was seeking anyways.
Right. So then what was that transition point for you? Like when did you develop the idea to develop your clothing business? When did that really start to become your reality?
Probably I was in Vancouver and I was playing baseball. I'd moved back to Canada. I was done, kind of the competitive baseball, and I started playing just men's league, to pass the time on, a couple of nights a week and on the weekends. And one of the guys that, it's kind of a funny story because I responded to a Craigslist ad for who was looking for baseball players, because I didn't know, I had moved to Vancouver and didn't know anybody there, right? So I was like, well, I got my baseball equipment. At least I can play baseball. Maybe I'll meet some people, and responded to a Craigslist ad for baseball players, and so I ended up going to this dude's house randomly because he was like, yeah, we got a game, come check it out, so I ended up being, that guy owned a screen printing shop, right? And he ended up becoming my business partner, so he handles all the production, most of our production anyways for section. But it started with just, I always had, I bought a computer and started designing and stuff, and he was like, oh yeah, I can print t-shirts and whatever, so I started making t-shirts with an old hockey logo from my reserve, and that kind of was like, I made a small run of them and sold them to some family and some friends and stuff like that. And that was just kind of like, hey, maybe we could do something with this, and he was like, yeah.
At that time?
What's up?
How old were you at that time?
Man, I was like, it was in 2013, so 7 years. I was like 30. I just turned 30.
Okay.
And that was really kind of like the catalyst for, and I had seen, there was a few, I was friends with Shosho Esquiro, and she was kind of a big inspiration for the Indigenous fashion, but there wasn't a whole lot of a market out there for Indigenous streetwear. And I've always loved streetwear and stuff like that, surf and skate wear. And t-shirts was obviously like the easiest thing to do. And so I was like, well, we should do a brand, like an Indigenous brand. I only saw like one or two brands out there. And so I knew there was nothing really, at least that I, gravitated towards a whole lot, and I was like, maybe we can do something. And I always envisioned like creating something that people are stoked to wear and represents who they are. And whether it's dope graphics or slogans or whatever it is, and that was really kind of the initial idea, and it just kind of grew from there.
So elaborate about reflecting on some of those things to represent who you are. Like your logo is so powerful. I don't know if a lot of people really know how that came to be. So tell us the creation story of the logo before you go into like really what it represents.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Section 35, like, some of the work I did was based around, rights and title stuff, and consultation and, understanding the framework of, I guess your rights being enshrined. I don't know, it was just something that sounded really cool, but also there was, a little bit of a political undertone to it. So, the name came first, and then the design, we sat down and, we just found a simple, typeface. And then it was just like, I was like, there's got to be like a feather or something, and so we drew up a feather, and, honestly, it came together pretty seamless. Like logo, if you ever do graphic design, logos are sometimes they're like the worst things to do because you can go through so many revisions. But we did a logo, and, just thinking about the feather and the foundation of the business and the messaging. And it just kind of, I was like, it's a talking feather, like when people get up and speak and they hold that feather, you know who's speaking, and nobody talks, right? And when those guys talk, it's, you know, it's truth. You tell the truth, right? And so it all just kind of, you know, funneled into what the foundation of the brand is, right? And so that's been kind of our staple logo for a long time, and it's a strong logo.
I think that's unique to actually say, in the sense that you've incorporated so much history into that logo. You talked about it being a talking feather, you know, and you talked about truth, and you talked about incorporating a lot of those cultural teachings that mean a lot to Indigenous people. Why do you think that's so important for you? Like, why was that so intentional? You know what I mean? For you as part of this co-founder as Section 35, why was that so important?
I think it's just it's the world, the lens that we look through as Indigenous people, right? And I think trying to be as authentic as you can, and speaking from the heart, and being, you know, saying what you mean, and meaning what you say, and just something that's original. And if you're Indigenous, or even if you're not, like it means something, right? And so it just comes natural, I think. So
Nice, man. It's a cool logo, and I think there was a quote you said at presentation you're doing. I think it was in your First Nation Reserve, actually, and you brought up that a simple T-shirt can make the biggest kind of impact. You know, and I
mhm.
feel like something as simple as a feather inside of a circle has such meaning and depth and value and such a positive impact. So I think that's powerful on its own, my man. And think in transitioning to that, you know, I remember, you know, reflecting more on that presentation you did, and you mentioned that you weren't really into fashion shows at the time. And I think, like, up to date, if I may, Vancouver Indigenous Fashion Week, Indigenous Fashion Week Toronto, the Otapiaki Fashion Week, right? Did I say that
Yeah.
right? In Calgary, you did a gallery in Santa Fe. So tell us a little bit about what goes into preparing yourself for a fashion show. Like, I come from putting on events. I've hosted an annual art, music, and fashion show every year, but I'm like more or less the organizer. So I help bring in a lot of the talent to showcase what they do. But as a designer, like, what goes into preparing for a fashion show?
Man, it's tough because you know, like, and when I always said, I was like, I don't like fashion shows, but like, you know, our staple clothing is not necessarily stuff that you see on the runway. So, I mean, you can put it on the runway, but for me, it's like, if I'm going to put something on the runway, I want a little bit, you know, to step up my game a little bit. You know, so a lot of that usually involves me making custom one of a kind pieces and paying a little more attention to what I'm making. And so usually it's a lot more preparation and creation on, you know, more unique pieces rather than, you know, some of our staple lines, you know. And so I like to create something that, you know, and hopefully turns heads, or at least people, when people see it, they're like, oh, that's dope, you know. So
Tell us a little bit about, like, the time frame, in the sense of creating something. What is the time that goes into creating something from scratch?
man, I mean, it could be, generally it like takes me months, you know. Like, I start working on multiple pieces. I'm kind of a, I guess, a scatterbrain at times. I've got multiple projects always going on, so it's like from one piece, I'll get an itch, and I'll be like, okay, I'm going to work on this, and then I'm like, oh, I've got to go over here, and, you know, so there's always a lot of moving parts. Like Toronto, Indigenous Fashion Week Toronto, which was supposed to be held here in the end of May. You know, I'm still working on that stuff, you know, even though it's postponed, but like, I started working on that stuff in January, right? So, you know, it's a lot harder now for me with a family and stuff, because I've got to juggle those schedules. But it's months, you know. And a lot of times, like, as I've got, you know, I guess, more experience, I'm trying to create a more cohesive collection rather than, you know, kind of sporadic pieces, and even that itself is challenging, you know. So
See, I asked that because I appreciate the journey that it takes to create something. You know, as an artist, it takes me months, sometimes years, to create an album. And I
mhm.
think sometimes people may not, they just see the end product, right? They see the
Yeah,
amazing fly sweaters, the hats and the logos and, you know, all the campaigns that go behind it. They just see that, you know, available to the public. But what they may not know is, like, all the work, grind, hustle,
yeah,
creativity. You call yourself scatterbrain, but I would say that's a creative mind. And I
yeah.
think you know, there's a lot of work. Like it takes months sometimes to produce, you know, one piece of clothing that you really can stand behind and feel good about. So I think that's important for anybody who's looking to start a business or into the clothing. It's not always what you see on the forefront. You know what I mean? There's a lot of grind and grit that goes into it. You know, you have to manage your life. You have to be able to, you know, manage all the things that go into creating a piece. Like we didn't even talk about what is the process in creating a hoodie. Like we didn't even go into that. You know what I mean? But without going into that, I wanted to know a little bit more about, you know, you talked about fashion shows. I wanted to now I wanted to hear what your experience was like at that LA pop-up that just happened kind of recently, right? So last summer. Yeah, share with
I mean,
us a little
we
bit what
had,
that was like, man. How did you line that up?
well, it's crazy because that kind of was, you know, the genesis of that whole pop-up started with, you know, the collaboration that we did, and I'm part of a collective uh, called Obsidian, and a shout out to anybody from Obsidian who's
Big
watching.
shout out, big shout out.
That's myself and four other artists, Natani Means, Yaz like Jaws, OXDX, and First Citizen. So there's five of us in this collective, and we ended up linking up with the Hundreds out in LA, which is like one of the long-standing street brands out there, and they've got a shop up on Fairfax, which is kind of like LA streetwear central, you know. And so through our kind of initial design process and working with them, kind of deciding on what this drop's going to look like, but the idea kind of came up was like, well, what if we did a pop-up down here? They happened to have, you know, a shop that was going to be open for renting for a couple of days in the summer, and they were able to, you know, and shout out to those guys, they gave us a really good deal on the space because it's not cheap, right?
No doubt.
And the thought was like, well, what if we brought, you know, the res down into Fairfax, you know? And so we all ended up kind of putting together our, you know, some merch for stuff, and we tried to make an event for it for a couple of days, and it ended up being pretty dope because we had natives coming into the pop-up and hanging out, and they were just like, man, I'm from around here, and there ain't never been anything native on Fairfax, you know. And people were coming from, you know, hours away to come and see a bunch of natives hanging out on Fairfax and selling their clothes. And we had some of our friends out there who, you know, are performers come down, and so we tried to do little like events every night and socials, and, you know, it ended up being a success. Everybody had a lot of fun, and it was just, you know, I think I hope maybe one day we can go back and do that again. But, you know, that was a special time for sure.
Is there a favorite event or a show that you've attended as of recently that really resonates with you?
Like a fashion show
Yeah,
or
fashion show, or like you also did a gallery in Santa Fe, right? Like
yeah.
any type of event that you attended, was there a favorite that really sticks out to you?
I mean, last year we actually did the Indigenous Peoples Day celebration with the city of LA, and that probably was one of my favorites. We got to end up actually doing the fashion show. We showcased the Hundreds and Obsidian collection. I mean, we debuted it there, but there was performers, you know, from all over, you know, representing their nations there. You know, there's rappers, singers, you know, fashion people, and it was just a day-long celebration of like Indigenous people and the Columbus Day being abolished in the city of LA, right? So
Wow.
and that was I guess the kickoff to that collaboration, and we dropped the collection that night, and, you know, people ate it up, and it was a pretty cool thing to see. So I look back at that, and, you know, I think you can ask any of the guys in Obsidian that was probably
That's
one of our
massive.
highlights. Yeah. So
That's massive. Wow, man, that's really incredible. So you talked about Obsidian. I think that's an amazing collaboration with so many amazing trailblazers out there. And I think it's so fascinating to kind of just reflect on a little bit about what you're saying. You know, we have this young kid from the res who started this clothing brand. And as a result, with all of your relationships and connections with people, your friends, you know, the people you looked up to are now like in the game for real. Like some of those artists, without saying names, they're making big waves out here and doing big things. And so for all of you to collaborate on something like Obsidian makes such a huge impact. And you said it yourself, there's kids who are rolling up to your pop-up and be like, yo, there's never been anything like this. And so I think that's so significant. And
yeah,
what is, yeah,
I,
go ahead, man.
yeah, I just, you know, and I'll give a shout out to Natani Means and
Yeah.
Yaz. They were kind of the first guys that connected with the hundreds and believed in, you know, my brand and the other two brands to come in and kind of help drive the creation behind that. And then just also Bobby Hundreds, Ben Hundreds, you know, all the guys over at the hundreds for, you know, trusting a couple natives to put together, you know, to collaborate with them on something and use their platform to share the messages that we push, you know. So I always just want to make sure that everybody gets, you know,
No doubt. And
sure.
like the reason I'm reflecting on that, I appreciate you bringing up those names, is like we're stronger together at the end of the day, you know? I think there's so many people out there trying to do it on their own. And I think that's such a good example of what it could look like if we were to collaborate on things, you know, if we were to come together as people and still have your own brand and still have your own thing and collaborate together, you can see the impact that it creates. So I think that's an important story just to kind of reflect on a little bit as we're navigating through your journey here, man. I appreciate that a lot. And I think another cool thing to bring up on that note is like you've always been recreating yourself, I think, within Section 35. You know, I think your earliest one, if I got this in chronological order, you know, Fuck Colonialism was, I think, one of the first campaigns that you had. Tell us a little bit about what that is, what it means, and we'll
Yeah.
kind of go through this list a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and that kind of came up when I first, you know, we were getting ready to move towards an online launch. We'd kind of been around for about a year and a half, but we hadn't really gone live. I was kind of just, you know, I didn't have the confidence to really like put myself out there and put the brand out there because I didn't know, you know, there was nothing really like that. And so, you know, really hesitant and just unsure of myself, but just through networking and kind of telling people what I was going to do, you know, I got to a point where I was like, okay, we need to do this. So I wanted to kind of create something that was, you know, like in your face and something that really grabbed people's attention. And I remember the first shirt kind of like that was from my buddy Jared from OXDX down in Arizona, and his said, does it say Native Americans discovered Columbus, or, you know, and that shirt, you see that shirt everywhere.
Yeah,
But I
no
was,
doubt.
we need a statement like that, right? And
Yeah,
you know, there was a lot of, you know, people doing stuff with decolonized and all that stuff, and I was just kind of like, man, fuck colonialism, you know. And
straight up.
I was just, oh shit, we could, you know, we could do, you know, maybe we could do logo flips or something. And the first one we did was the Washington Capitals. So I just flipped the logo, you know, like not really thinking anything of it. I was just like, dude, this looks dope. It looks like a hockey jersey, but it says fuck colonialism.
Yeah.
And I started kind of marketing it, you know, leading up to the launch, you know, and a day or two before the launch, we got a cease and desist letter from the NHL.
Oh,
So,
really? That's real right there.
yeah, and so
You
we
know?
had to pull it, but it kind of realized that like, okay, that, you know, people kind of, the message resonates with people, right? And so, well, it's even better, you know, like fuck Kelowna. These guys have been stealing from us for a long time. At least they can just let us steal their logos, you know. So, okay, what other logo can we flip from, you know? And so it moved into the Coke logo, right? Like, and
Right.
so we just kind of kept spitballing with all these ideas of like the irony of, you know, natives stealing from mainstream society and flipping it with a message that's, you know, anti-colonial. So
For real. Talking about colonialism, let's get into Canada Don't 150. How did that come to be, man?
That was, that was leading up to there's a Canada 150 celebration that went on throughout the country, and I've been talking with my homie Theo Horn, and she had shared some images from, you know, out in her territory, and there was just, they kind of just resonated with, you know, I guess where we were in a mind space right now of like, fuck colonialism, and she's like, well, what if we did some t-shirts, right? And I was like, okay. And some of them, one of them was a guy out from her territory, and he had passed away, but I was, you know, I'm always hesitant to use photos of people that I'm not related to, or I have, you know, so it was kind of, well, maybe there's something we can do to raise money for, you know, a school or some type of programming. And she ended up talking to the guy's family and explaining, you know, the campaign, and the other picture was of her mom. So we had permission to do both of that. But, you know, the real thing was I wanted to use that, anything we made off that, and just drive it back into that territory, because that was where those photos were from, right? And so we ended up coming up and just making a small campaign with that, and all the revenue we made off that, we pumped it back into a school out there that focuses
Wow.
on language and culture revitalization, right? And so, the images were, I I still have them, and I look at them, and I still got one of the shirts too. It's kind of ratty now, but but those people really connected with that stuff, and I was really happy with how that went.
Man, I think I appreciate that, and like I mentioned earlier, I do an annual art, music, and fashion show. I did it for 5 years, and when Canada was celebrating 150 years, I was just browsing online on Facebook, and like I saw so much hate being thrown towards that whole concept. Like understanding the history, if you know the Indigenous history, you can understand why that might be. But just sometimes I think throwing shade isn't necessarily a positive approach or a solution to anything. And so I dedicated it was my third annual art, music, and fashion show to like bringing up a context of indigenizing Canada and what that means. And so for you to create a line or something like that to give back, I think is the way to do it. If we want to make positive changes in the community, if we want to make positive changes in the world that we live in, it's about being creative and doing something positive. I really think that's important. That's how we can really make change that's effective and in a good way. So I appreciate you, man. Kudos to that. And moving into this next one, because I know everybody's going to recognize it when I bring it up. It's definitely been one of the most prominent, logos that you've created or brands that you created around it. Let's talk about Kill the Mascot, Save the People, man. And I know for a fact that there was a moment that you saw a group of people, 3 people to be exact, that came out wearing this clothing line that was a real pivotal moment for you. So kind of share with us what that process was like, man. How did you get to that point?
Yeah, I mean, that started, the genesis of that. Oh
Yeah,
man,
man.
it goes way back to almost before we even launched, and that was done in collaboration with Santiago, a homie of mine who's based out in Chicago, and I had bought, the Dead Hawks logo. That's kind of the foundation for that line. I bought a painting off him that kind of that was one of the originals of that piece, just to collect, because I was like, oh, this is dope, like I really like it. And just, I spitballed with him. I was like, dude, what if we, collaborated? We'd already started collaborating on some other stuff, but before I'd even launched, I was like, dude, I'm kind of launching this clothing brand. Would you be down to collaborate one? He's like, whenever you're ready, let me know. Man, we ended up, after the NHL stuff got our stuff pulled, I hit him up, collaborated with him on a couple pieces, and then the idea came up about kill mascots, and so we spitballed ideas, and he just threw it down one day. He's like, kill mascots, save the people. And I was like, I like that.
Right.
It can work. And then just kind of, okay, though, let's step up what we're releasing here, so we started, I got designed a bunch of patches, like jersey patches. I was like, dude, we need a hockey jersey, obviously the Blackhawks are hockey, we need a hockey jersey. I bought, I went to the thrift store, and I bought a big, like a used army camo jacket, and I did a kind of just a prototype, and I was like, oh, that looks pretty dope, with the rockets on it. And I ended up finding kind of like an army surplus store that could supply those to us, and it ended up being a lot of work, because we were, we did everything by hand in the shop, heat pressing and all the stuff that we put on those jackets, and it was just kind of painstaking, even the hoodies and the t-shirts. And then we got my buddy Blair Russell to come shoot the lookbook, and he's still probably one of my favorite photographers of all time. Like, he's just got the eye. We just set up in our print shop. We had a couple models come down, some of our friends who modeled before, and I was like, let's shoot the lookbook. I had Summer Peters from down in the States. She's a dope beater. I had her bead 2 like Dead Hawks medallions, and I've still got one that's like hanging here somewhere, and some got the other one. But we just shot a really cool lookbook, and kind of did like a decent sized drop, but it was kind of really putting the production level up about compared to what we'd done before, right? And that, I still think that probably really took our game up a bit and put us on the map, and that whole collection pretty much sold out like the first night, and
Crazy.
We had never made those kind of sales. I think we had like, the first couple hours we were at like 10 or 15 grand in sales, and we were just like, this is unheard of. We didn't ever expect that. We were just, small time, and so people
Last
really like
Dance.
that stuff. Yeah. And so we've done a couple of variations of it. And like you said, I like to kind of recreate myself in ways. And so I don't like to do too much stuff over and over again. Cause I personally get bored of stuff. Right. But,
Right.
I look back at that and that was, I still look at the lookbook and, and I remember like the first time that I saw kind of the guys from Tribe Called Red wearing it, and,
Right. And this
that
was at a
was,
time where like they were at the hype of their career. Like,
yeah, they were, yeah, those guys were like the pinnacle.
that's right.
I'd met them a couple times and, I was like, I'd love to get you guys some gear. And, they were, yeah, for sure, dude, and then I remember they came to town and I went and hung out with them and I just brought a bag full of like the Kill Mascot stuff. Cause I was like, I'm just going to like, throw a Hail Mary.
Yeah.
And that night they all came out wearing everything that I gave them. And I was just kind of like,
Whoa.
and I
Right.
just look back and seeing those pictures. And I remember like where I was, as far as the brand and at the time in the game, I was still like just really fresh and green, and so for me, I was like, these were like the guys at the time where I was like, if I could have anybody wearing my stuff, it would be Tribe Called Red, and
Facts.
shout out to those guys. They've been supporters from, ever since then. And still to this day, like I stay in touch with them and they support us. So
Amazing. I think there's something to say there. Like, kind of like music, I'm relating to your story in the sense that you never know which record or which thing you put out to the public is going to be a hit. I think as a creator, we always go into it thinking every piece is going to be that hit. That's what's going through my mind anyways. And you never know. And like, I think to relate to you on another front, I just asked you if you wanted to be part of this podcast and you agree. So sometimes you never know who's going to actually support you or reach out or reply unless you ask, and I think sometimes you'll be surprised. So kudos to you for having that bravery to kind of just ask, a Tribe Called Red, especially at the time, both in their career and in your career. I think it takes effort, it takes bravery, it takes courage to do that. So on that note of courage and bravery, I put together some questions around, the 7 grandfather teachings. I try to fit them into each one of those to kind of make this, a little bit interesting, a little bit different. And I think we're already talking about courage and bravery. So how do you manage? I think this is a really important thing to talk about, but how do you manage your mental health and or any anxiety you may experience as a creator? When you do these fashion shows, when you're putting on these galas, when you're working crazy hours and you're managing your personal life with your business life, like how do you manage your mental health, man?
Yeah, it's tough. I think being an artist, you're always, I think your biggest challenge is always yourself, right? Like it's easy to doubt yourself. You're always loving something and then you hate it. And every time I release something, I get nervous because I'm like, dude, what if it tanks, because there's times where, something you think is going to do really well, like nobody vibes with it. And then there's mediocre stuff where you're like, oh, I'm not really, I put it out, but whatever, but people really like it. And so it's stressful sometimes, and for me, like, I guess I've started to do it enough where I'm okay to just calm myself. But like the best thing I can do is just unplug, and focus on family and put the phone away, because when you're building up to releases and you're marketing and you're doing you're trying to read people's reactions and stuff, and you start to forget what's around you and what's important. And your kids want attention or your wife wants attention, family needs you, and you're just glued to your phone. And I've realized through trial and error that that's not healthy for anybody, right? And so
Right.
trying to find that balance between the creative work and being an artist, like I live in my head so much all the time. But
Right.
just the biggest thing I think for me is just taking a break and trying to be present, rather than getting wrapped up in what you got working on or what you're designing or what you're going to release, and so probably one of the biggest things for me is just like family time and exercise. If I can, I try to exercise and get a good sleep, so those things are important.
So
Really
just
simple,
yeah, no doubt. And just to be intentional about this, because I think it's an important topic, is like, so you put your phone down, is what you said. You put your phone away. So do you like put it on sleep mode and make sure that it's not part of your day, or do you keep it close enough by where it's still in reach? Like
well,
intentional in the sense of disconnecting. Just maybe elaborate a little bit more about how you disconnect.
It varies. Yeah. I mean, like I've gotten better at just completely turning it off or just leaving it in my office and not even paying attention to it. When I go to sleep, I turn it off, right? Like I try not to look at it in bed.
Nice.
It's easy to be the first thing you do in the morning is to go look at your
Facts.
social media. And, but I think a lot of it is like my wife, you know, she was an artist performer, you know, so she relates to, you know, the stuff as an artist and what you're trying to do. And she's helped me a lot through and like understanding how to manage, you know, my anxiety or, you know, the distractions that come with, you know, having your art or your work out in the public space. Right. And so she's you know, she's really, really good to kind of like guide me through that stuff because she did it long before I did it, you know? So,
I think that's a good point too, is like, I think what you're really saying, you know, correct me if I'm misinterpreting, but having somebody to talk to, having
mm,
somebody who knows you well enough to be there for you and kind of support you through those challenging times, whatever they may be, is
yeah,
really important. And I think that's an important thing to say during these COVID times, to be honest. Like, you know, if you're going through difficult times, you know, definitely exercise reaching out to the people you care about and have that conversation. Because I can tell you right now, like, if it wasn't for my weekly phone calls with my family that I have every week, you know, I
mm,
don't know where my mind would be at. You know what I'm saying? And thank the creator and thank mankind for creating technology. And I
yeah,
think a lot of people could look at technology as a devil, but it's all about how you use it, to be honest. And
yeah,
if we use it for the good and for the positive, we can make those positive impacts and you can take care of yourself. So I think you're making some really good points that through these busy times in your life as a creator, make sure you take the time to disconnect. Make sure you take the time to connect with the people you care about the most and
mm,
invest that time, because when you do that, would you say you become a better creator as a result?
absolutely. I think like for me, probably having my son, you know, he's 20 months now, but like he's probably been one of the biggest like changes in how I approach things. And he's also like he inspires me as well, right? But he also forces me to, you know, to look at all this stuff and focus on what he needs, you know, and not what I need. Kind of highlighted, you know, in a sense, like before you really have kids, like how focused you are on yourself and your ambition or whatever you want to do. But when there's somebody that depends on you or wants your attention, right? Like you realize you have that instinct as a parent, you know, you're like, okay, this can wait. You know, this guy is more important right now. And so that's been probably like one of the biggest influences in kind of helping me navigate through all these issues. So
Amazing, man. I think that's a beautiful thing. So on that note, give us a day in the life of what it's like on a regular time frame. Obviously, a day in the life now is a little bit different from what it would normally be. So, what's a day in the life of Justin Lewis?
well, obviously the little man wakes up at like, you know, some days he's up at 6, you know, or else he's up all through the night, whatever. But he's up early before everybody, so it's always easy getting him up, changing him, you know, getting him ready if he needs breakfast, you know, take him downstairs, and then, you know, once he's kind of settled in, I'll go sit at my, you know, computer. And generally, like, because we run such a small team, there's email requests or, you know, whatever inquiries and stuff, you got to handle that. I work a day job, so obviously like the early morning is kind of my wiggle room to get certain things, you know. And then if I go to work, and then on the weekends, obviously, like I'll design or there's production, you know, you've got to put together tech packs for production, or you've got to fine tune some designs. There's a lot of different things, reports, you know. I'm starting to get better at like tracking things, you know. As you start to run your own business, you realize like pretty soon, like your gaps, you know, when you first started and what you didn't, you know, you thought you knew everything, but you learn as you go. And, you know, so a lot of times it's not just creating, right? You know, when you have, you know, bills to pay and stuff like that, like it's running a business. There's a lot that goes into that, and managing your bills and your costs, expenses, whatever it may be. You know, that's a lot of what my time is trying to figure out how do we get, you know. And then when you have all that stuff kind of nailed down, it's like, okay, designs, how can you put together some designs? What is your next release going to look like? You're starting to look at calendars, right? Moving backwards from a calendar. And so with the state we're in right now, like it's been, it's kind of good because it's allowed me to really slow down and kind of look 6 to 12 months ahead, right, and start to work from there backwards. Whereas, I think the past year was such a big year for us that it was kind of like go go go. You didn't really have time to catch your breath at times, and it's easy to get lost in that. And I took a couple months off because I was burnt out. I'm like, man, okay, I got to reevaluate this stuff. So a lot of my days, it's business stuff. It's not so much creating. Most of my creating probably happens in the evenings when the kids go to sleep, right? And all that stuff's done, and now I can sit down and I don't have distractions. Like, I'm kind of finicky when it comes to designing. Is I have a hard time, like, if there's kids running around and needing attention, it's hard for me to really focus in on the creative side of things. And I find my brain creatively turns on in the evenings. And so during the day, it's always, mostly like the business, the operations, day-to-day stuff. So,
Man, that makes a lot of sense. Like, so there's so many things to that. Like, I think a lot of people earlier on, from what they see, they see the cool aspects. Like, even when you drop a video and some of the creation process of cool printers, it has a vibe to it, And I think if you're looking to start a business, there's a lot of work that goes into it. There's a lot of grind. Like, there's doing a lot of things that you don't want to do in order to accomplish the things that you want to. So how do you keep yourself motivated to do the work that you don't enjoy? Like, what is that thing that keeps you motivated, man?
usually it's the final product. I think, getting, like, right now I'm working on kind of cut and sew for fall and winter, right? So we're already looking ahead, and it's kind of sampling the whole prototype sampling process. It gets monotonous because you got to be, you're specific with your design and the specs and stuff like that, and it's challenging because sometimes it completely takes a lot longer than I think my phone was dying, so I had to just
all good.
zip out there. But it just, it's time consuming, but it's also time sensitive. And the worst part, I really don't like, is building tech packs for product. Yeah, I like to see the end product, right? But realizing, I think probably tracking on the calendar helps me. Like, if I have, you can't see, but I used to have a big visual calendar on the wall that my wife kind of was like, you should do this, and I was bought it. But working with people, in the mainstream game, like the hundreds, and seeing how they were, it makes sense to work backwards, right? And it kind of forces you, well, this needs to be done by this date and this date. And there's a lot of stuff, running a business it's not fun,
No doubt.
but you got to get it done, and I think it's just the business, you're kind of like, the buck stops with you, right? So you just got to get it done. And sometimes you need to just get up and handle it.
So just to kind of dive into some of these things that you do in order to achieve, your branding in a good way and go about it in a healthy way. How do you practice self-love, my man? What does that look like?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have to think about that one.
How do you stay in balance with everything that you got going on? Family life, work life, events. How do you keep yourself in balance?
I've got a lot of different hobbies. I mean, obviously family, I try to go back home to my reserve as much as I can. And just, when I go home, I don't really do much. I just kind of ground myself, at my parents' house. And it's just good to be kind of where you grew up, right? Family, but like hobbies, like I love to play guitar. My kids, they love creating and stuff. And so, there's just a lot of different things, spending time outside, it's just, I guess it kind of goes with like my self-care, right? Those kind of go hand in hand for me, right? So.
Nice. So I'm going to ask just a couple more questions, my man, and we can wrap this up, because I think there's so much we've learned from you, and, giving insight about what goes in behind the product, what goes in behind Section 35. Like, there's a human being there, you know what I mean? So what does humility mean to you, and how do you demonstrate that personally?
Yeah, I think just, one of the things, I guess, that to try to be personable with people, like people have kind of like got to know the brand, and they realize that I'm the guy, I try to respond to messages, you know, people who are spending money, you know, like just to be on the same level. I'm not better than anybody, you know, just because I've, you know, done a few things. It's like we're all just humans on the same level, right? So I, you know, I try to be personable. I don't think I'm better. You know, I try to respond as much as I can to customers and to people who follow the brand, right? So it's just, I think maintaining that personal, you know, as much as I can, you know, without like taking away from my family and stuff, but just trying to be real, you know. I think to me, like, you know, we're all just kind of trying to do our own thing and trying to do the best, you know, with what we've got. And so just trying to keep it real. You know, that's about it.
Bless, man. I appreciate that. So in closing,
Mhm.
um, you know, this is such an amazing thing for me to experience on all the things that led up to how you got to where you're at. You know, I think that's an important thing to reflect on. I think a lot of times we have conversations about, you know, all the good stuff. And I think we talked a little bit about the grind and the grit that goes into manifesting. And so, you know, a big part of the reason why I wanted to do this No Blueprint podcast, you know, webinar series is to help provide inspiration to other people like us, man. You know, other people who are like us, maybe earlier or younger, you know what I mean, who are looking at considering starting a clothing business or starting a podcast or getting into the entrepreneur space. I think I want to flood, you know, social media and flood all these avenues with people who reflect our ways of life too, people who are of Indigenous descent, people who have a shared identity, you know, to be able to see us reflected in these social medias and what success also looks like. So in saying all that, you know, understanding the true intentions behind these things, what words of advice would you give to a younger version of yourself? So let's say, what would you have told yourself when you were 16, 17 years old? And like, what advice would you give to somebody aspiring to start a clothing business?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, and I look at like some of the people who kind of had the, you know, I guess influence in pushing me to do what I do. But I think the biggest, you know, probably one of the most important things is just to do it. You know, like you never know until you try. Um, you know, I had, you know, the first person that believed when I told them the idea of starting a clothing brand. You know, I was like preparing for them to kind of laugh at me, right? And they just said, just do it. You just got to do it, you know? And so if you believe in it and you think you can do it, then just do it, you know? And then
Amazing.
grind, work, you know, that was probably, and that's, you know, playing baseball, you know, I was taught, you know, before I went to college, one of my coaches kind of said, you know, you're going to be at school with a bunch of guys who are just as talented as you. And it's going to come down to who works harder. Right. So, and
Straight up.
you know,
That
so
makes sense. I've heard the saying where, you know, sometimes hard work can actually outdo talent. You know what
it's,
I'm saying?
yeah,
So
dude.
definitely grinding makes sense. So to wrap this up, tell us a little bit about what's up next, like what's going on with you right now. I
Yeah.
know you just dropped a new water bottle. So what's happening with you right now, man? What's going
Yeah,
on?
I mean, we actually dropped just a small collection today. Part of the business, you know, and just in me growing the business or shifting the business, and some of the things that I'm really like inspired by is in the fashion is trying to create sustainability in an industry that's kind of known for wastefulness, right? And how do we, as a small brand, implement more sustainable practice and product, and without also gouging the prices of, you know, making something that people can still have access to. And I struggle with how we do that without pricing out people, right? And that's the thing, is like we also still want to make sure that our products are accessible for the people who want to support and want to represent. And so I'm constantly like trying to find ways to try out sustainability. And, you know, obviously today's release it was all upcycled stuff. You know, most of it was, you know, dead stock and inventory that's just laying around that would never be used for anything, right? And so it was like, well, it's, you know, maybe we can, and this was an idea I had, you know, last year, was what if we, you know, we started like kind of just repurposing stuff. And there's a lot of people out there that do that kind of stuff, and but how can we do it, you know? And it was well received, and so it's kind of got I guess a step in the direction that like I envision like long term is like finding more sustainable ways. Obviously, like a new water bottle, like a reusable water bottle, you're eliminating plastic, you know, and the company that we collaborated with on these, and you can see one's right here.
Amazing.
Here, you know, the bottle comes with a code, and there's a code you can register, and it actually tracks where the percentage of money that went into this bottle goes back into like projects around the world for clean water, right? So, you know, all these little pieces of stuff is kind of like, how can we as a brand do better? And then also I'll just be working on other ways to find ways to give back to the community and to initiatives that we believe in, right?
Amazing, man. Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Justin Lewis, co-founder of Section 35, sharing with us his story, where he came from and how he got to where he's at today. If you don't know how to reach him, you can check him out on Section 35 on Facebook. You know, check him out on section35.com. Follow his Instagram, Section 35 everywhere. Make sure you support a solid brand that's about giving back and I think has a sense of purpose and meaning. So Justin Lewis, we appreciate your time that you contributed to this No Blueprint series, you know, in this inaugural event. So thank you for your time, my man. I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me, and shout out to everybody that kind of checked it out. You know, thanks for tuning in.
Thanks a lot for tuning in, Justin. We appreciate you, man.
Thanks, man.
Wash day. This was an amazing inaugural No Blueprint podcast webinar with Justin Lewis. I learned so many incredible things. And next up, we have Kenny Starr coming up next Thursday. So tune in next Thursday, 7 p.m. We're going to try and tighten it up a little bit with the timing. You know, we definitely went into an hour, which is crazy. And that just goes to show how amazing these stories are. Tune in next week, Thursday, 7 p.m. for our second episode of No Blueprint. Thank you to everybody who's tuning in. Shout out to Raven for making sure you keeping me in check. So I appreciate all this. And we'll see y'all next week. Wash day. Thank y'all for watching and thank y'all for listening.